Parkland versus Bethesda, a requiem. For decades, a meme in the JFK assassination has been the supposed discrepancy in the rearward extent of bone loss in JFK's head between the doctors and nurses who attended him at Parkland Hospital and the extent of the wounds documented at Bethesda Naval Medical Center. The case for the larger rearward defect was based upon Parkland eyewitnesses' descriptions photographically depicted in Robert Groden's book, The Killing of a President, and a single erroneous measurement on the autopsy descriptive sheet filled out at Bethesda. To put this in perspective, the argument should be between the Parkland personnel versus Dealey Plaza, the Zapruder film, and the autopsy photos and x-rays. This is a classic case of eyewitness error versus the photographic documentation which exists from both before and after Parkland personnel made their individual assessments. This is not to argue that there wasn't an exit wound in the rear of the head, just simply its extent. This overestimation in bone loss by Parkland doctors has been used to try to convince individuals that the x-rays and photos must be fake since they differ from eyewitness observations. The pictorial display in Groden's book has a series of Parkland personnel waving their hands behind their heads in an attempt to show how far back bone loss extended. Without a mirror, they had no idea where their hands were actually placed. As such, there is a variability in each individual assessment. Moreover, in 1988, Nova had 4 physicians, Delaney, Peters, McClelland, and Jennings, view the original authenticated autopsy photos, and all 4 found no discrepancy between what they recalled at Parkland and the autopsy photos taken at Bethesda. What we are assessing is bone loss, and for that we can look at the Zapruder film, which shows where and when skull fragments were ejected. After the first shot to the head from behind, 4 fragments were ejected from the mid-right skull forward. The rearward extent of this initial bone loss is defined by the Harper fragment, which was exploded out into Dealey Plaza, as was the more forward located Weitzman fragment. The Harper fragment's origin in the right mid-parietal bone has been determined by FBI photos showing characteristic arterial grooves on its inner surface, which anatomically allows its placement. This is exactly where it can be seen arising on the film. This also debunks the mistaken belief that the Harper fragment is occipital bone. This assertion was made by a Dallas pathologist who examined it, but rendered his opinion without having seen the Zapruder film or the autopsy photos and x-rays. After this initial explosion, the rear of the JFK's head is undisturbed and no rearward expulsion of bone has occurred. Very shortly after, another bullet struck the top rear, which would have been fired from the front. This is the only bullet which could have caused bone loss in the rear of the head. It is known where this bullet impacted because there's a 6.5 millimeter metallic particle centrally located to a series of fractures radiating outwards from the same point, which is located at the top rear of the head. The impact dislodged a single large triangular skull fragment, the delta fragment, backwards onto the trunk of the limo. No other skull fragments are seen ejected from the rear. In one corner of this large fragment, multiple small metallic particles were deposited from the same bullet which had left the 6.5 millimeter metallic particle in the top rear of the head. In addition, there was external beveling in this same corner, indicative of an exit wound. The delta fragment determines the rearward extent of bone loss, which was forward of the higher impact point. Nearly the entirety of bone loss was compromised by the total of 5 recovered skull fragments. On the postmortem skull x-rays, there are no metallic particles low in the rear, which could have caused lower bone loss, as suggested by the Parkland eyewitnesses. Now we can turn our attentions to the findings at Bethesda Naval Medical Center. The skull x-rays taken shortly after JFK's arrival show the 6.5 millimeter metallic particle at the top rear, with fractures radiating outward, with 2 prominent ones measuring 6 and 4 centimeters extending downward into the still present right occipital bone. If occipital bone had been missing, you wouldn't be able to see the fracture lines. The damage to the skull was diagrammed by the autopsy team, and they diagrammed the 6 by 4 by 3 centimeter fragment of right occipital bone. One measurement on the autopsy descriptive sheet, which has been cited as evidence for greater bone loss, is a notation of 10 by 17 centimeters missing, with the 17 centimeter dimension representing the forward to rearward bone loss. If true, this would indicate bone loss beneath the higher impact point. This is contraindicated by the photos and x-rays showing the occipital bone to be present, and by the 6 by 4 by 3 centimeter measurement of fractures in the right occipital bone noted on the same descriptive sheet. The apex of this triangular bone fragment can also be seen in the photos of the interior of the rear of the skull. Intact but fractured occipital bone, as seen on the x-rays, photos, and the 6 by 3 by 4 centimeter notation, is incompatible with 10 by 17 centimeters missing from front to rear. The autopsy report itself says that the greatest dimension of bone loss was 13 centimeters, not 17. 13 centimeters of bone loss in the anterior-posterior dimension is entirely compatible with the bone loss seen on x-rays, as well as the Zapruder's film's documentation of skull fragments lost from the wounds. The 13 centimeter measurement may well have been included in the notes that Humes burned. The illustrations of the damage to JFK's head made by the Warren Commission show the occipital bone present as well. Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, from eyewitness observation at the autopsy, told the Warren Commission that there was 1.5 to 2 inches of bone above the lower entry hole, entirely consistent with the x-rays and Boswell's 6 by 4 by 3 centimeter notation. The 10 by 17 centimeter missing notation, contradicted by multiple other avenues of evidence, is the only item which can be cited to support bone loss low in the rear of the skull, outside the varying amounts of bone loss the Parkland personnel claim to have seen. Given this, is there another interpretation of the 10 by 17 centimeter missing notation? I believe there is. The autopsy team stated that during their manipulation of the scalp, fragments of skull fell to the table. If the 6 by 4 by 3 centimeter isolated bone fragment had been one of these which fell to the table before this measurement was taken, then 10 by 17 centimeters could have been noted as missing. A special note should be made of a specific observation at Parkland made by the head of neurosurgery, Dr. Kemp Clark. He stated that both cerebral and cerebral tissue was seen extruding from the head wound. The bullet fired from behind entered just above the cerebellum, and while there are no metallic particles low in the rear of the skull, as this was a jacketed bullet, the temporary pressure cavity created by this bullet's passage could have disrupted cerebellar tissue. This has nothing to say about the absence of occipital bone, as its presence is well documented on the post-mortem skull x-rays. The photographs taken of JFK's brain show the cerebellum to be intact, however. The photos have no identification to say that this is JFK's brain. If Dr. Clark was correct, then the photos are not of JFK's brain, and if the photos are genuine, then Dr. Clark was mistaken. This can never be resolved. What can be stated definitively is that occipital bone was fractured but was still present. The meme of occipital bone loss based solely on eyewitness observations and a single erroneous measurement on a descriptive sheet, refuted by the authenticated photos and x-rays as well as other notations on the descriptive sheet, should be relegated to the trash heap of JFK's research. Just as a bullet hole in the windshield, that there was an entry wound in JFK's throat, and that the Harper fragment, being occipital bone, should be relegated to this trash heap as well. These mistaken claims only cause unnecessary confusion among neophytes to the JFK assassination and gullible individuals who have not looked at all the evidence in its entirety. Further, these claims promote the mistaken belief that much of the valid, hard evidence has been faked. This is completely counterproductive to a full understanding of the nature of the head wounds, which proves conspiracy.